As industrial growth in the United States increased rapidly during the last quarter of the 1800s, waves of immigrants and rural farmers moved to urban areas around the country, especially in the north, with cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York swelling in population and becoming hubs of industrialization. As industry boomed in America, scores of factories opened in the bustling north that needed a large workforce that didn't require any special skills. In the coming years, many would move to work in these factories. During the Gilded Age, around 12 million immigrants moved to America's large urban areas in search of work opportunities and to get away from the political turmoil and civil unrest that plagued parts of Europe at the time. Big business tycoons bought out large plots of land, wanting to monopolize on agriculture in the States. Farmers, unable to compete with such competition, sold their land and moved to cities to find work in factories. As a result of this, jobs revolving around agriculture diminished during this time, while employment in manufacturing skyrocketed.
During the Gilded Age, an increasing number of Americans migrated towards urban areas to labor in manufacturing factories. Jobs before the Industrial Revolution were drastically different compared to those prior. They were assigned to one-step jobs that was monotonous and sometimes dangerous. It was not uncommon for them to work 10-hour shifts 6 days a week, and the wages that were earned were barely enough to support their families. Those who were injured or otherwise unable to work were simply replaced by another readily available worker. There was little to no job protection for employees. Eventually, the workers had had enough. They started organizing and developing labor unions. Labor union members participated in strikes in an effort to evoke change from their uncaring business owners. Labor union members were met with intimidation and sometimes violent resistance from their owners or bosses. One of the worst outbreaks of labor violence in American history was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The railroad company decided to cut wages in order to save money and reduce costs. Workers organized a strike that shut down 2/3 of America's railroad tracks. The President, Rutherford B. Hayes, used federal troops to end the strike. The ensuing violence resulted in 100 workers losing their lives. Another common practice during this time involved child labor. It was during the years of 1870 to 1932 that it was at an all-time high. When they turned 13, orphan boys were sent to apprentice in a trade while orphan girls were sent into domestic work. Niles' Register also said that factory work was not for able-bodied men, but rather better done by little girls from age 6 to 12 years old. This labor was perceived as useful not only to the child, but also to society as a whole. The Charles Loring Brace Children's Aid Society believed that the best way to bring a child out of poverty was to have them labor at an honest trade. The 1870 census found that 1 out of every child was working. Labors that the child of the working class performed were varied. The most common job done by children were street trades, miners, textile workers, and manufacturing. Many parents viewed their children as their property. Urbanization caused a housing shortage, which made for overcrowded, poor living conditions for many people who moved into urban cities. The trash piled up in the streets, drinking water was poor, sewage systems were ineffective, and air quality was poor. Eventually, infectious diseases hit the cities and they spread swiftly. Medical practices were not advanced enough to cope with such large numbers of sick people. Churches that were once refuge to the poor became incapable of sufficing the demand, especially when the wealthier church members fled to better areas. Health in the regards to children were intolerable. The new recognition of the vulnerability of children to the deadly and psychological stressful conditions they faced in the workplace was a key factor in the reform of child labor practices. By the late 1800s, a growing and reliable body of knowledge had been found on the biological vulnerability, special needs of the child, and the magnitude of the problem of child labor.
The 19th century was filled with immigrants flooding into American cities in search for a better life. In New York City, the population doubled every decade from 1800 to 1880. Because of the rapid increase in population, with most of the new population being poor immigrants, the demand for cheap housing skyrocketed.
In New York City, buildings that had once been single-family abodes were gradually divided into multiple living spaces to accommodate this growing population. These were called tenements. The urban streets or districts that contained them were highly populated by the poor and were known as slums. With such an awful system came the desire for reform. Although legislation was passed to try to regulate housing in the Tenement House Act of 1867, there were still growing problems and it didn't guarantee enforcement. Jacob Riis, author and photographer who experienced the life of a poor immigrant firsthand, wrote a book titled How the Other Half Lives. In his book, he took pictures of the grimy, crime-infested slums to accompany his text. This was Riis' attempt to shedding light on such a harsh matter. The facts finally came to surface about high infant mortality, how easily fires spread, and how 12 adults slept in a room with some 13 feet across. This legislation would eventually improve sanitary conditions, fire escapes, and increase access to light. The new law would be enforced and ensure these tenements were updated. Another huge negative effect of urbanization was corruption in the political world. New York's Tammany Hall symbolizes urban corruption and boss politics of the time. Although it was founded in 1789, the Tammany Society we refer to today was brought to life in the late 1860s with the election of William Marcy Tweed as the head. Under his and his associates' reign, the Tweed Ring, Tammany Hall engaged in spectacular graft. Graft is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain, which is exactly what the Ring engaged in. The Ring openly bought votes, encouraged judicial corruption, and controlled city politics. Estimates of the amount of money that the city lost to the Ring range from $30 million to $200 million. John Kelly, also known as Honest John, helped in the arrest for embezzlement. And afterward, he overthrew Boss Tweed and ruled Tammany Hall from 1872 to 1886. He transformed Tammany Hall into a more disciplined political machine through the spoil system. After Kelly's retirement, and for the remaining part of the Gilded Age, Richard Crocker became the boss. Crocker consolidated Tammany's power by eliminating its rival Democratic machines and ensured the mayoral election of Tammany lieutenants Hugh Grant and Thomas Gilroy. Along with Tammany Hall and its leaders came the rise of bossism. Bossism is a system of political control centering from a main powerful figure, the boss, with a complex organization of lesser figures, the machines. It leans on manipulation of voters. When immigrants moved to the cities and urbanization was on the rise, the boss and his cohorts gave away coal and food, got the sick into hospitals, obtained leniency for wayward through the courts, and secured government jobs and other work for the unemployed. Bossism was primarily on the local level, but the machine in very large cities soon exerted state and national influence.
Urbanization in the Gilded Age had many negative effects, but we tend to overlook the positives. The progressive movement of people created new inventions and recreational spaces that we take for granted in today's times. In cities, new taller buildings called skyscrapers started to emerge. The cities were already growing outward, but they decided they would grow upward as well. Because of the increasing cost of real estate, upward growth of buildings became a viable solution compared to buying and maintaining more land. The first true skyscraper, the Chicago Home Insurance Building, was built in 1885. The building of these skyscrapers increased the need for the then modern elevator, distributed by the Otis Elevator Company, in order to make taller buildings more functional. The main draw to cities was the industrial side and available jobs in the factories. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and it would soon become available in cities when the first commercial power plant opened. In factories, electric lights permitted operations to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This increase in production required additional workers, and this demand brought more people to the city. Gradually, cities became illuminated at night with electric lamps. We became a 24-hour society. There was an increase of economic activity past sunset. It would take decades for rural areas to be supplied with electric power to the same extent as cities were. For the invention of electricity, cities stayed awake and never went to sleep. We wouldn't even recognize our world without Thomas Edison. Because of the diseases brought upon by the unsanitary and crowded urban living conditions, cities responded by building effective water and sewage systems. It was made possible by new chemistry and biological discoveries. They wanted to provide sanitary water through filter systems. There were numerous inventions produced by the Gilded Age, but also created areas for recreational activities and the opportunity to socialize. Parks had bright and vibrant flowers, plants, and trees that awed the common populace. An example of this is the construction of Central Park. Other benefits were the buildings of museums, theaters where people could view comedies and dramas, and libraries, which quickly became centers of studying and learning. After 1865, Horace Mann's comprehensive education system was put into place in many places around the U.S. After 1865, children were required to attend school, which dramatically increased the number of students enrolled, and the literacy rate rose to 90% of the U.S. population. Tax-supported public schools began to emerge. Public education wasn't the only type of education that was changing. Higher education, such as colleges and universities, also experienced changes. Land-grant colleges were established under the Federal Morrill Acts. There were colleges that were for the education of women, such as Smith University. The college curriculum was fundamentally changed by teaching modern sciences, and an enjoyable college experience developed as college sports and social clubs became available to students.
Along with advancements in technology came further advances in social sciences, and period philosophers emerged who would dissect and scrutinize the ideologies of the Gilded Age's people. During the period, Charles Darwin and other scientists' research and hypotheses on natural selection and evolution started gaining traction among the scientific community. From this, a group of philosophers would emerge in the 1880s, the social Darwinists. They became a movement centered around the concepts of natural selection and Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest concept, and how they would be used to criticize modern America, where the weak diminished and fell into obscurity, while the strongs took center stage in politics and economics. These people viewed common life in America as a struggle, where only the strongest would prosper, and those who did so at the expense of the weak. Richard Ely, a philosopher and scientist, used economics to study labor unions and other economic institutions to expose and critique the outdated and dogmatic operations of the laissez-faire systems and find ways to remedy it. The Puritan work ethic was a theological concept coined by the German sociologist Max Weber. It encouraged hard work and diligence in the lives of Christians whose work and toils would please God, and he, through admiration, would bless and bring good fortune upon those who followed this ethic. Horatio Alger was one of the most influential Gilded Age writers in America. He is famous for formulating the rags to riches story, which detailed the struggles of lower-class citizens who escaped from poverty and achieved financial success through hard work. He wrote over 100 books and used his technique so frequently that it came to be known as the Horatio Alger myth. His books conveyed that hard work and good qualities would be rewarded. These books appealed to the majority of Americans who were impoverished and were inspired by Alger's books to achieve success through following the morals detailed in his stories.
Urbanization enriched cities with cultural benefits and allowed them to expand to what they are today.